Hi, my name is Monica Blaylock, and I'm doing for my oral presentation Women's Rights. Women's rights are rights that are entitled to women that in the past have been taken away simply because they were women. Rights such as access to education, options to higher paying jobs, as well as higher position jobs, the right to voting, or have access to adequate medical attention, and just overall being respected and treated as a human by males and others. Women were and still are at times viewed as beneath men simply because of their gender. In the past, women were to be housewives, cooking and cleaning, taking care of the children. Women were not allowed to have an opinion in handling of businesses or financials for their household. They were thought as not smart enough to be able to know or learn how, more than anything more than motherhood and housework. Women have been fighting for their rights for a very long time, starting all the way back to the year 1848, the very first meeting held for women's rights in Seneca, New York. It was ran by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. While only 100 people showed, Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafted a declaration of sentiment, grievances, and resolutions. The main goal of the declaration was to show that all humans are created equal. In 1851, former slave who became a women's activist, Sojourner Truth, gave a very famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, in Akron, Ohio. The premise of the speech was of how much she has done in her life, even once as a slave, as much as any other, including males. It is a great speech, and I certainly recommend, and I have it here that I'd like to show you. It is not a very long speech, but it is very meaningful. Eventually, the current movement outgrew itself, and by the 19th century had evolved and strengthened for the cause. Susan B. Anthony had become a women's rights activist in 1850, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, fought against those who wanted to silence and oppress women, and were also very active in the abolitionist movement. Together, they formed the National Women's Suffrage Movement. Upon many other important reasons they were fighting for were family responsibility, educational access, possibilities in the economy, and the chance to sit in and have a say in political debates. I found some fun facts that I'd like to read. New Zealand became the first country to where women were allowed to vote in 1893. In 1776, founding father John Adams' wife made a request to him to be more open to keep women in mind than those before him in his position. In May 9, 1960, FDA approved the first birth control, giving women the option to decide to have children or not. The next person in regards to women's rights is Alice Paul. Alice Paul was born on January 11, 1885 in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Her parents were very much supporters of equality for all. Alice Paul's mother was also a women's suffragist and often took Alice with her to the meetings, so there is no wonder why she took an interest in the same topic. She is known as a vocal leader for the 20th century of women's suffrage movement. Alice Paul was a women's activist among other important titles. She was one of the leaders of the campaign for the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This amendment was centered around women's rights to vote. Alice Paul was a college graduate who attended University of Pennsylvania and Columbia University. Alice Paul met Lucy Burns while in England, where they both joined women's suffrage efforts. Here is where Alice Paul learned tactics such as protesting and hunger strikes. Alice Paul joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1912. She was in charge of the Washington, D.C. chapter. She is partly responsible for the separating and formation of the National Women's Party. Alice Paul's first parade of picketing for support was held on March 3, 1913 in Washington, D.C. It was the day before Woodrow Wilson was set to become president. Thousands of women showed up to the parade to support women's rights. Although President Wilson declined any amendment to the Constitution in regards to women's rights, Alice Paul organized the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage on April 7th. This union was specifically formed in order to lobby Congress. In 1917, Alice Paul was joined by over 1,000 people who were called the Silent Centennials. Together they began an 18-month picketing at the White House. The picketing signs read, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" The picketers were put through verbal and physical torture by outsiders simply because they did not think what they were fighting for was right. The picketers were arrested and Alice Paul was sentenced to 7 months in jail. While in jail, Alice Paul started a hunger strike where she was threatened to be sent to a mental hospital. Her work and efforts had finally caught President Wilson's attention. By year 1918, President Wilson finally advised his support towards women's rights and suffrages. I have a picture of the parade that I'd like to show you. And you can see there is the sign that says, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" It's just such a strong message in a simple photo. The next person I have that in regards to women's rights is Betty Friedan. Betty was a feminist writer and activist. She was born on February 4th, 1921 in Peoria, Illinois. Her mother was a writer and worked as a journalist. Betty is of Russian and Hungarian descent. She is a college graduate from Smith College in 1942, majoring in psychology. She also attended the University of California, training to become a psychologist. Betty was a reporter for the Federal Press in New York for 3 years. She later went on to write for UE News. This is where Betty started to get involved with unions and labors. It is also the period in her life where she became intent on women's rights. Her attention peaked even more after she completed a 5-year-long survey among her classmates and suburban housewives. Friedan found that these women to be unhappy. They were wanting more to obtain jobs and go to work, but were almost claimed to a life as a housewife and carer for children. Betty put her frustration into a book published in 1963 titled The Feminine Mystique. Betty Friedan's books made women realize they too felt similar to the description in the book and wanted and needed change. Along with Pauli Murray and Aileen Hernandez, Friedan created the National Organization for Women, abbreviated NOW. Betty was the very first president. NOW's mission statement to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of America's society now, exercising all the privileges and responsibilities thereof a truly equal partnership with men. NOW's first mission was to achieve equal opportunities for all genders for employment. In 1969, Betty Friedan was also part of the founding the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, which we may now know as the NARAL, Pro-Choice America. Betty is also partially responsible for the organization of the National Women's Political Caucus, which was targeted toward changing the laws that were old and outdated that were more inclined to the male gender. Betty worked very hard being an advocate for women's rights during her life. She taught at colleges as a professor and traveled around to different lectures talking about women's rights. She was a beautiful person who helped change the world, known to many as mother of the modern women's movement. Next, in regards to women's rights, I have ERA, E-R-A, or the Equal Rights Amendment. It is the amendment that guarantees the equality among all genders. Women from our past have stood up and said, "I will be treated fairly. I am a human being just like males, and all women deserve to be respected in all aspects of life." Oh, I do apologize. I did want to show you a picture of Miss Betty. She was a big help in creating women's rights. So, and back to the Equal Rights Amendment, Alice Paul was the first person to introduce the first version of the amendment. It was titled the Lucretia Mott Amendment. This amendment of this version of the amendment was introduced into Congress in 1923. In 1943, Republican and Democratic parties supported the Equal Rights Amendment, adding it to their political platforms. It wasn't until 1943 when Alice Paul altered the amendment, calling it the Alice Paul Amendment. This version stated, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Unfortunately, at this time, the Equal Right Amendment was still being prohibited by labor movements, which was thought that equal rights would pose a threat to the structures of power already put into place. It wasn't until the 60s and after riots and movements did the labor union finally stand for equal rights. On March 22, 1972, there was a proposal as the 27th Amendment to the Constitution and was sent for ratification. It gained several ratifications in its first year, but unfortunately decreased as the years went on. There were parties that were against the Equal Right Amendment, being that they were afraid that they would lose support from their husbands and the possibility of being sent to fight in wars. Others thought the ERA was only trying to gain power that would in the end cost money to businesses. At this time, there are 38 states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, and other organizations to this day continue to fight to have all 50 states ratify the Equal Right Amendment. Women and individuals who are for the cause have come such a long way in creating equality for all. We are all created equal across the board and should be treated as such. Now, I did find a website specifically to now that I would think that you would like, and I do apologize if you aren't able to see it, but it just shows everything that they've accomplished throughout the years. And if you're interested, I certainly suggest that you check that out. And the last era for the women's rights is now, NOW, which stands for National Organization for Women, founded by Betty Friedan, Paula Murray, and Aileen Hernandez in 1966. The very first president was Betty Friedan. They have had several great presidents, but Kristen Nunes is the current president at this moment. NOW is the largest organization for women's rights. They've had hundreds of chapters across the United States with thousands of participating members. In the past, civil rights movement helped feminists take their stance in making their voice heard. NOW has had its hurdles to jump through in order to get women's equality to where it is today. For example, Aileen Hernandez and Richard Graham fought hard to have the Title VII of the Civil Rights implemented, which unfortunately were outnumbered in opposing votes. They were fighting for discrimination against gender in the workplace. NOW fights for all aspects of women's equality. In 1966, they petitioned to have it possibility to allow all genders the ability to apply for employment opportunity ads. In 1967, NOW adopts bylaws under their national board so that they would create chapters, becoming a part of the supreme government body. In 1968, NOW boycotted outside of the Colgate-Palmolive headquarters for not allowing women to hold higher paying jobs because of the company's policy which restricted women from lifting more than 35 pounds. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm, an African American, became the first woman elected into the House of Representatives. Shirley was a member of NOW, a breakthrough for not only NOW but for all women. In 1969, NOW created a week called Public Accommodations, where members would rally at men's only places, writing sex discrimination. This was just a small amount of the accomplishments and trials NOW went through for women equality. They were and still are smart, brave people that wouldn't take no for an answer. Individuals who were pushed but only pushed back harder. I appreciate your time. Thank you.